Good morning and welcome to the first Forging Armour Conference. I am your conference host, Reverend Perry Hart. And before we get started, we'd like to thank our conference location hosts, Bethel Evangelical Lutheran Church in Kitchener, Ontario. Forging Armour has been started as a location where Christians may come to have their armor forged stronger, giving them a better ability to defend this faith that they have. This makes them apologetic by design and focused on what the scriptures purely teach for the life of the Christian. Today we are blessed and thankful to have with us Reverend Charles St-Onge, who was born in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in engineering. He received his Master of Divinity from Concordia Theological Seminary at Fort Wayne, and also holds a Master of Theology in Science and Religion degree from the South African Theological Seminary, which is based in Bryanston, South Africa. Charles served as a pastor in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as well as Houston, Texas. Currently, he serves in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in the Latin America and Caribbean region. In his role as an area facilitator for this region, Charles helped strengthen Christ's work in the Cayman Islands, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. And when not helping in this work, Charles serves as the mission pastor of Ascension Lutheran Church in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, working with French, English, and Chinese worshiping communities. He is the author of the book, 5 Things You Can Do to Appreciate Science and Love the Bible, which is a Concordia Publishing House publication, and he's also a frequent guest on the Issues Etc. radio program. Please welcome to the Forging Armour Battalion our speaker for today, Reverend Charles St-Onge.
Well, it's great to be back here in Kitchener-Waterloo. As your pastor mentioned just a few minutes ago, I did graduate with a degree in engineering from the University of Waterloo. So I did live here for 5 years, of course, in a co-op program. You're here 4 months, gone 4 months, back and forth. But most of my time was either in Kitchener or in Ottawa, with the exception of one work term I did in Toronto and another one in Calgary, just to get a feel for what it's like out west. Did grow up in Canada, did my Master of Engineering degree actually at Queen's University in Kingston before I ended up getting hauled down to the United States of America. And that was mostly because in the 90s, as you might remember, we had that thing where we decided to balance our budget and cut all sorts of civil engineering work across the country. And so I had 3 job offers in the United States and 0 up here. So I ended up down in the United States, where I ended up meeting my wife, Deborah, who's a native of Ohio. Ended up getting married to her, and in the process and during that time decided to go to seminary. So I studied at Fort Wayne Seminary and ended up spending a whole bunch of time in the United States, 10 years as a pastor, before entering the mission field. Actually ended up serving in China for a number of months with our 2 daughters. My daughter Olivia is actually here today with us. She's 13 in grade 8 at Lake of Two Mountains Secondary School in De Montagne, Quebec, outside Montreal. My younger daughter Sophia is in grade 5 in elementary school there in De Montagne, just outside the city. So after a few months of serving in China, that's where I ended up being transferred into this new role where I get to live in Montreal, finally back home in Canada, working in French and English and helping out with a Chinese language congregation in the city of Montreal. And then also serving as area facilitator for the mission work in the Caribbean. So a lot of people ask, well, how does that sort of work out? Well, all of our missionaries in the Missouri Synod have multiple hats that we wear. We all want to stay involved in actual mission work ourselves, and so my mission work is in helping Pastor David Summers, whom some of you know, in growing the mission work in Montreal, but then also supervising a growing mission field in Puerto Rico. When I first started, we had 2 missionaries on the ground. We now have 1 Venezuelan pastor who is serving in Puerto Rico, a LCMS pastor, 2 lay missionaries, and we just had a 2nd LCMS pastor accept the call to serve there, and we hope that he will, after his fundraising, be able to be serving on the ground by December or January near the end of this year. And we have another LCMS pastor and his wife, who's a deaconess, who we hope will be joining us early in the winter. So this is going to be quite a mission field in Puerto Rico, which has meant me learning Spanish in addition to French and English. So if I seem confused at times, or I start using words that you don't know, it may be because I'm pulling them in from other languages. I also have 3 months of Mandarin. I'm probably not going to use any of that right now, because we're going to be talking the language of science and mathematics, which really is its own language. You can have mathematicians, physicists, chemists, biologists who speak English, French, Mandarin, all sorts of other languages, get together and be able to communicate, because in some ways, science and mathematics is its own language. It's its own way of communicating, and that's going to be one of the themes for the day that we're going to spend together, that we are learning that in some ways mathematics is another language through which God speaks to us in our world. I grew up not a confessional Lutheran. So I grew up actually in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, or previously to the formation of that body, what was the Lutheran Church in America, Canada section, or Canada Synod. And then, of course, you all know that we've gone through all of these realignments and mergers, and this church body joined that church body. And so back in the 80s, it became the ELCIC, which meant that I grew up in a church body that never really dealt with the issue of Scripture and science. Culture said 14 billion years ago, the universe came into existence, and 4 billion years ago, the earth was formed, and maybe 1 billion years ago or less, life first appeared on the earth, and we just accepted that. And so I sort of grew up with 2 different ways of looking at the origins of the world. One was what I was reading in the Bible, but that was kind of the poetic interpretation. But then science told us how it actually happened. Then I went to the University of Waterloo, and I was at Conrad Grebel College, some of you might know as Mennonite College, and we had some evangelicals who came into the dorm with me who studied science along with me, and they started asking me, so you say that you're a Christian and you believe all these things that science supposedly is telling you about where the universe comes from and how old the earth is and where life comes from, but don't you know the Bible says something different? I said, really? I didn't know that the Bible said something different. Well, look at what Genesis says and look at what Scripture says about how old the earth is. So for the first time, I ran into Christians who said, we think Scripture teaches something different than what you grew up believing about the age of the universe and the origin of the universe and the origin of life. Something I'd never really thought of before. Then I moved to the United States, and I was in an ELCA seminary. So lots of acronyms being thrown around here, but it's a Forging Armour Conference, so it's kind of militaristic. And if any of you have worked with the military, you know they love acronyms. Everything's an acronym. So ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And it was in ELCA seminary that I often tell people, everything that I had ever been taught to believe about the world, about mathematics and science, and about Christianity was laid out in front of me to really seriously examine all at once. And as I did that, my first few months in seminary, I came to a realization. Either what my church believed was true in which case I'm not even sure why we would bother being Christian, never mind studying to be a pastor. Because seriously, there's a lot of great things you can do on a Sunday morning, never mind a beautiful Saturday like today, than sitting in a hard pew like this, singing words like we just sung a few minutes ago, and listening to these texts from this ancient book we call the Bible. Or I had to go back and really ask myself, what do I really know about the world, about God, about Christ, and about how we construct meaning in the world? And I would say I had sort of a crisis of faith. And at the end of that crisis of faith, I ended up leaving that seminary and leaving the church body that I grew up in and joined what we call confessional Lutheranism. Went to Fort Wayne Seminary, who accepted me, praise be to God, with gracious arms, welcomed me in, and I restarted my studies there, and then eventually completed my Master of Divinity. So, unlike some people that I know that grew up maybe in a different church, but always sort of had a real scriptural understanding of the world, and then maybe realized that their church had left them, I actually went into seminary, what you might call a liberal, and came out a conservative. So what I'm going to talk about today is the question of knowledge, at least in this first hour this morning. Because we now live in a world where we are being challenged, and I don't mean Christians, I mean all people, all Canadians, with the question of how we know what we know. The problem is very few people ever stop to ask themselves that question. How do we know what we know? Some of you who follow science and technology know that we are well beyond the age of Photoshop. We are all kind of worried about Photoshop in the sense that people can take a picture and manipulate it to show you something that maybe is not true. We are now able to take video and audio and marry them together and actually have you or I saying things in a video that we never said or never meant. The technology is now there to do that, so that you could actually be watching in the next few years somebody saying, look at what the Prime Minister of Canada said in a news conference over in the Czech Republic last week. And they show a video clip of the Prime Minister standing up and saying, I really think that we need to give freedom for families to kill their 1 and 2 and 3-year-olds if they feel like they're just becoming a burden on their family. Oh my goodness, how could the Prime Minister ever say something like that? But the reality is they never actually said it. We just manipulated audio and video to show them saying that. So if we are entering an era like this, where people can manipulate what people say, what people are speaking, what their ideas are, then we really are entering an era where everything we see, everything we read, we should ask the question, is this in fact the truth? And we, I think, as Christians in the church, might be being called upon to be the ones in our society who ask the most dangerous question of all, how do you know that? How do you know that? How do we know things as human beings? I would suggest that, and there's different ways that you can divide up the concept of knowledge, but I'm going to propose 4 main ways that we come to arrive at certain things that we know. One of them is perception, what we might call empiricism. I know something because I saw it, or I heard it, or I touched it, or I smelled it, or I tasted it. I have direct sensory knowledge of something, and that's how I know it. Okay, so how do I know that the sky is gray? Because I walked out of my door in the morning and I looked up and it appeared to me as if it was gray. How do I know that Pastor St-Onge is talking to me right now because I can hear it with my ears. This is a way of knowing, and it is the way that originally drove the scientific process. Originally. Science is driven by things that we can perceive with our senses. Another way that we know things is emotion. I call this mysticism. And those of you who have studied psychology, especially modern psychology, know that this is something that we really have to take account of when we talk to people. We might call it intuition or a gut sense of something. And this is how we arrive at an awful lot of our knowledge. We don't like to admit it, and our society would like to think that it operates outside of this realm, but this is actually what drives an awful lot of us, is our feelings, our emotions, our gut reactions, and our instinctual senses about things. So, for example, I've been married for 18 years. If somebody asks me, do I love my wife? I would say, yes. And then if they ask me, the main question we're talking about this morning in this first hour, how do you know that? I can't really say it's because I've seen my love for her. I might see the results of my love for her, but I can't actually see the love itself. It's something that comes right out of here, or we might say even out of here. Out of our heads, because it resides up there somewhere. But it's not something that I can perceive with my senses, and it's not even something that I can necessarily, the next couple things we're going to be talking about, come to logically. But would I therefore say it's not real? No. I would say it is something very real. And so this is a way that we come to know things, through emotion. Reason. Logic. This is a third way that we come to knowledge in our world. So I often use this identity statement as a way of getting people thinking about how is reason different from feelings and emotion, or different from senses. So if A equals B, and B equals C, then C must equal A. This is a bedrock principle of logic. But it is not something that we've come to understand through our senses. Again, you can see it reflected in something that we can see, or reflected in something that you can hear, but it doesn't exist out there that you can actually see. A equals B and B equals C, therefore C equals A, is something that exists even if you are blind and deaf and have no sense of touch. It still exists. And even if you don't feel that it's true, it's still true. So where exactly does logic or reason exist? Well, this is something that we might talk about in the next hour after our break, or we'll see how quickly we go this morning in this first hour. The fact that logic is a third way of knowing things that does not directly come out of our senses, and it's not tied to emotion. How do we know it's not tied to emotion? Because of Mr. Spock. All right, those of you who are Star Trek fans know that the Vulcans have attempted to direct their society based on logic. That doesn't mean they're not emotional. Those of you who have followed the whole span of the Star Trek universe know that Vulcans actually are quite emotional. But they've learned to control their emotions and not derive information from that as much as they derive it from reason. So, in a blind alley, late at night, we would much rather run into the credible Hulk rather the incredible Hulk, because the credible Hulk always backs up his facts with documented sources. He's angry for a reason, not just driven by emotion or even from his senses. The fourth way that we know things is what I call through revelation. Okay, I want you to think about this for a minute. This is how we know things based on authority, and in our world where we are now overwhelmed with information and data, this is how we know the majority of the things we know. whether we admit it or not. So I often give this example, especially for those of you who are kids. You're going to school, and you're in history class, and your teacher stands up in front of you and says, back in 1867, the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed a law called the British North America Act, which gave the 4 provinces of Canada the ability to unite and become what we now know as the Dominion of Canada, with an independent existence from the United Kingdom. Now you're sitting there and you've got your notebook open or your computer now, because we're in the technological age, or your iPad or your tablet or whatever, and you're scrolling down these notes, or you've got the record button on and you're recording what your teacher is saying, right? In 1867, the Parliament of the United Kingdom, blah, 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 British North America Act, blah, 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 right? Your teacher has presented you with knowledge. Then you go home after football practice or band practice or whatever, after your part-time job, and you walk in the door, and dad or mom, who've been waiting there anxiously all day since the very moment you walked out the door, ask you when you come through, what did you learn today in school? And you say, nothing. I have some wise parents here. They know how this works, right? Olivia, what did you know today? Nothing. But if you were a better child who really loved your parent and wanted to demonstrate that our taxpayers' money was actually, going to some important purpose, you could say, I learned today that in 1867, the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed a law called the British North America Act, which created the Dominion of Canada. To which your parents, if they had attended the Forging Armour Conference, would then say, as a follow-up question, how do you know that? And you would only be able to answer, because my teacher told me. How do you know that? Through revelation. Were you there in London in 1867 to, with your own eyes and with your own ears, actually see and hear this thing happening? No. Unless, of course, you're with the doctor and you get in the TARDIS and you go back and you actually see that happen. Did you figure it out through logic? Because apples are fruit, and because oranges are fruit, therefore in 1867, the United Kingdom passed a law. There's no law of logic here that you can apply that means that logically this had to have happened, right? Did you get a gut feeling about it? You're just sitting there, the Xbox, playing whatever it is that you're playing, and suddenly you're like, man, I think in 1867, there was a parliament in London that passed a law called the British North America Act. No, that only leaves one way that you came to that knowledge, and it is through revelation. Oftentimes, Christians are accused of believing things just because what? Just because the Bible said so. Well, the vast majority of knowledge that all Canadians have as they walk around, why I'm going to vote for the NDP versus the Progressive Conservatives or the Liberals, why I'm for the Trans Mountain Pipeline or against it, why I think global warming is happening or not happening. They know because some authority has told them. They've read it on a website or they heard it on a news broadcast. They just know it because somebody told them. Now, that's not to say that we battle in saying, well, I believe it because the Bible said it, you believe it because an internet site said it. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I am suggesting is that we should never just dismiss knowledge because it came to us by revelation, because that's how we know most things. If you're going to trust your history teacher, though, you might do some checks, right? You might go and grab a couple of other sources that you trust to confirm that the sorts of things that you're hearing from your history teacher are true. You do a couple of checks, and if those checks come back correct, right, what the teacher said here is also what the Encyclopedia Britannica said. I found some old ancient copy in a library. Or maybe it's even what Wikipedia said, because sometimes what Wikipedia says is true. Then you might come to believe that the rest of the things your teacher says are also correct. Do you know that's the same way that we in the Christian faith have come to accept the teachings of the apostles or the prophets? That we've tested, as you're going to see, some of the things that they've said and said, yeah, I with my own senses see that that is indeed how the world works. Or logically, yes, that makes sense. Or it backs up other things that I've seen, and therefore I'm going to accept the rest of what I'm reading in this text. So Revelation is not bad, but it does mean it's something that we want to test, and you don't want to let somebody get away with saying, I'm going to allow myself to have knowledge from Revelation, but I won't let you do it. Or to dismiss the Bible and not dismiss other texts or websites that you're getting information from. To hold them to a standard that is lower than the standard they're trying to hold the scriptures to. It's the same standard. Now, let's go to the Bible for, well, actually, did we go to the Bible yet? No, we're going to go to the Bible in a minute. The reality is that all of these sources of knowledge come in combination, right? There's never really something that we know purely through reason or purely through emotion. There's always some combination. So here's Professor Bob, who says, if P is false, I will be sad. I do not wish to be sad, therefore P is true. So what two sources of knowledge are they combining? Is he combining? Emotion and reason, right? So they're being blended together. Thank God I'm an atheist. There's sort of reason and revelation, right? Being brought together. Here's a famous quote from Albert Einstein: the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind a faithful servant. But we have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. What two sources of knowledge is Einstein talking about? Emotion, intuition, and reason, right? That both of them are gifts that we have been given as human beings to be used in concert, not to be pitted against one another. And of course, one of my all-time favorites from history, Blaise Pascal, both brilliant theologian, would have been a Lutheran if he hadn't been French. Actually, how many know the history of Blaise Pascal? He was part of a heretical, in the same way that Lutherans are heretical, movement within Roman Catholicism called Jansenism. Robert Jansen, not Robert Jensen, he's another guy. Professor Jansen, from whom Jansenism gets its name, basically believed that faith is a gift from God, it is not something earned, and that we are saved solely by the merits of Christ and not by the sacraments or works of the church. Gee, have you heard this before? Right? So basically Lutheran. But Pascal was very much critical of the Roman Catholic Church. Get this, because there was a new group within Roman Catholicism called the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, that were concerned that people weren't coming to Mass anymore. How do we get people to come back to church? Well, what's the reason they don't want to come? Because at church they keep hearing that they're terrible sinners and they need Jesus to die for them. Well, what if we lower the bar and convince people they're really not that bad and make church a little bit more fun? Maybe more people would come to Mass. So Jansenists, or not Jansenists, but Jesuit priests would start to do things in confession like this. You would come in and say, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. What have you done, my son? I was in a bar last night and I struck a man and I killed him. I've committed murder. Ooh, wait a minute. Have you really? Why did you strike him? Well, he sort of looked at me funny. Oh, well, he gave you cause. And God's given you emotions. And your emotions led you to simply strike out. And that's a natural thing to do when somebody looks at you funny out of the corner of your eye. God's not going to hold you accountable for that. You had a justified reason to strike him down. Come to Mass and you'll hear how much God loves you. Gosh, have we ever heard any theological approach like that in our days? So Pascal was very vociferous in his calling out the Jesuits for this and saying, you are basically dumbing down the law, and when you do that, you also dumb down the gospel, and you're making church about a bunch of people taking selfies of each other because they're so cool, and not about what Jesus has done for you. Now, that's Pascal the theologian. At the same time, of course, he was a brilliant mathematician. And Pascal is one of his most famous kind of crossings of his being a mathematician, theologian, is in this statement that the heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of. Again, recognizing that intuition should not be pitted against reason. We've been given both. Now, what does the Bible have to say about all of these sources of knowledge? Let's talk about empiricism first of all. I think every Christian in our day and age should have memorized these 3 verses from the first chapter of John's first epistle. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you. Now, I'm originally French, Franco-Ontarian. I should mention this now. You will notice I talk a lot with my hands. And that's why I move around. I hate standing behind a lectern. I stand behind the pulpit because that's what we're supposed to do during preaching, but I'm not preaching now, so this is okay. I think it's good to use your body to remember things. What is the key point of these verses? That which we have seen with our eyes, heard with our ears, touched with our hands, concerning the word of life, that, John says, is what we are proclaiming to you. Why is this empiricism? Because it's all about the senses. This is the first 3 verses of John's first letter to a church, where he could have gone to any of the other sources of knowledge for what he's about to tell them, but he goes to empiricism first. He does not say, well, I was sitting on a boat, and I was reflecting on all the things that have gone on in Jerusalem and the time that I spent with Jesus, and I got this gut feeling that we ought to follow Jesus' teachings because he's super cool. Doesn't say that. He doesn't say, I was smoking my pipe in my library, and I was thinking about the nature of the universe, and realized that rationally speaking, the clever and logical thing to do is to be a Christian. Does not do that. And he doesn't come to you and say, I'm just going to tell you about Jesus, and you're just going to have to take my word for it. He's kind of doing that, but he's starting from the perspective of empiricism. I am not going to teach you a philosophy. I'm not going to teach you a logical way of thinking about the world. I am not going to just tell you something by fiat. I am simply going to tell you what I've seen, what I have touched, and what I have heard about the Word of life, who is Jesus the Christ. Do you know what John is doing in these verses? He is making Christianity a scientific endeavor. I'm going to repeat that. He is making Christianity a scientific endeavor. It operates and functions in the same realm of science when it is done well. Because as I said before, science comes out of empiricism. It comes out of the ability to see, touch, and hear things. We do not have a faith, a religion, if you will, that is in some separate realm from science. We are all about a man who actually lived, that people actually saw, that they actually heard, that they actually touched in the real world. It's almost as if God let us run an experiment on him. And the result is our salvation. So, actually, good quote from G.K. Chesterton. It's in a bad color here, so you can't see it. But he prefers, riffing off of the Epistle of the Hebrews, we walk by what others have observed. When we use the word faith, we are not saying we believe something that has no contact with the real world. We are rather saying we have faith in what others have run an experiment on, and that is Jesus. All right, what does the Bible have to say about mysticism? Not super great things to say about our gut reactions and our intuition. So be prepared for this. You might know this from Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus said, do you know, what comes out of the mouth, the things you talk about, generally proceed from the heart, and it defiles you. For out of the heart come what? What comes out of your gut? Evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. And they are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone. Jesus says intuition should be incredibly suspect, and your emotions should always be under a watchful and reasonable eye. Now this, of course, is, I think, where the real conflict is today between Christianity and our secular world. Because while our secular world likes to think they operate on the basis of reason and empiricism, they generally operate entirely out of gut reaction. If you look at abortion, if you look at what is marriage, if you look at any of the big societal issues that have to do with morality, and you get in a discussion with somebody, those discussions will very quickly become what? Heated and emotional, right? Becomes a very emotional, and that means that there's a gut reaction that's happening here, right? My son and his boyfriend should be allowed to marry. Why? Because it's not right that they shouldn't. Why? Because I feel that they should be allowed to. What kind of a reaction is that? It's an emotional reaction. What kind of reasoning is it? It's emotional. I think as Christians, we need to remember what Jesus says. Don't fire back out of our own emotion. We can be very dispassionate about these things and say, look, we're just trying to be logical here. We have to be the logical ones and the empirical ones. And I'm going to, over the next couple of hours that are coming up, give you some good empirical and rational arguments that we need to make with people that generally in the world are operating out of emotion and not out of their brain. I have a little quote here at the bottom, a couple of them. One is that the eyes of the Buddha are always closed. This was the first sermon that my vicar in Houston, Texas, my first vicar ever preached. And I will never forget it because it was brilliant. He had me at like the first line. The eyes of the Buddha are always closed. Unpack that for me. What does that mean? How many of you are Buddhists? Okay, that's good. How many of you know Buddhists? Yeah, I mean, it used to be the Buddhism was like, other side of the world, right? The community in which my church building is in Montreal is mostly Islamic and Buddhist. Those are the religions in our community of 36,000, Park Extension. So we got lots of Buddhists around. Buddhism is very popular right now because it appeals to which of the four ways of knowing? Mysticism, empirical emotion, and gut reaction, and that's where our world lives. So if you look at a true statue of a Buddha, the eyes are always closed. Why? Because true knowledge does not come from your senses, and it doesn't come from reason, it comes from emotion. You've got to look inside yourself to find out the truth about the world. Meanwhile, Jesus comes along and says, that's the last place you should be looking. Horrible stuff comes from inside. Don't look there. Look outside yourself. Who is the most spiritual man in the New Testament, by the way? We talk about spiritual people. Like, oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Who is the most spiritual man in the New Testament? Jesus. John the Baptist. Actually, just from a strictly rational and empirical point of view, the most spiritual man in the New Testament is the Gennesaret demoniac. Why? Because he was asked by Jesus, who are you? And the answer was, we are legion. He had lots of spirits. Tons, a legion of spirits. He is the most spiritual man in the New Testament. not good. Just because you say you're spiritual doesn't mean you're in a good and happy place. Okay, what does the Bible say about reason? Well, you're Lutherans, so you know we've got this love-hate relationship with reason because the Bible presents a love-hate relationship with reason. On the one hand, Paul starts out his wonderful theological discourse in Romans by pointing this out. What can be known about God is plain to all people, because God has shown it to all people. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so all people are without excuse. So on the one hand, Paul says everything you need to know about the invisible attributes of God, God has made available to your senses for knowledge. Now that should be good news. Like, well, great. I mean, so it's all there. So we can know that there is an omnipotent and an omniscient God, and that he is looking out over his creation and sustaining it just by using our senses. Good news. Those of you who know the explanation of the third article of the Creed know that there is a bad news, that we cannot by our own reason or strength come to Jesus Christ our Lord or know him, right? Without the Holy Spirit enlightening us by his gifts. So sin is such that even though everything we need to know about God is available to us, we cannot put it together. This is why we're going to talk about this more in the next coming hours. The argument that we call the science versus Christianity debate is really not about science versus Christianity. What it's about is a common pool of data and a common world that we all live in and common access to the same things that we can see, hear, and touch, but a vastly different interpretation of what those things mean. It's not a question of facts, it's a question of the interpretation of the common pool of facts. Because we who have had the veil lifted from our eyes can look at all the facts and say, I see God's hand in all of this stuff. Meanwhile, somebody who does not have the Holy Spirit looks at all this and says, I'm an atheist. And I see purposeless, meaningless processes that have no real end goal in mind. How is it possible to have two vastly different interpretations? That is one of the demonstrations of how sin is operating in our world. And we've got to take sin into account when it comes to interpreting data. And lastly, revelation. Well, I've already sort of talked about this and the importance of not conceding the ground and saying, okay, so you're saying I can't use the Bible, so let's just use other sources of information. Much more fruitful is simply to realize that most people in the world have most of their knowledge from some source of authority. And say what this is a question of which sources of authority do you consider reliable, and which ones do you not consider reliable, and why? Why do we read the Bible and consider it to be authoritative? Why does somebody else go to www.thingsthatyouwouldnotbelieve.com and finds that to be authoritative? And have a discussion about that. Most people that dismiss the Bible as a source of authority have never read it. They have no idea what's in it. Anybody know Tony Campolo here? He used to use this argument all the time. He used to teach sociology classes, and there would always be somebody who says, the Bible is just a book of fairy tales and myths, and it contradicts itself all over the place. And he would just look at them and say, can you name 5 of the contradictions for me? I don't know. I've just been told that it contradicts itself. I don't know it from having read it myself. I don't know it from having logically approached it, and I don't know it from, or I know it from a gut reaction, but I don't know it from actually having looked at the thing myself. All right, in the 5 minutes that we have 5 minutes before break. The 5 minutes we have left, this is perfect timing. We're going to stop here with a quick discussion of what we mean by science, because we have to be clear about our terms. What do we mean when we use the word science? And I would suggest to you that people mean different things when they say the word science. We use a lot of words in our discourse that we don't define. And oftentimes conflict arises between people because they're both using the same word, but they haven't defined what that word means. It was very easy to keep Christianity distinct from Islam, for example, when Islam was still very much an Arabic faith. They were locked into using Arabic as a language of spirituality. We use the word God, they use the word Allah. Clearly, two different entities, right? Until we discover that the word Allah in Arabic just means the God. So now we have Muslims talking about they're worshiping God, we worship God. Oh, it must be the same thing that we're talking about because it's the same three-letter word. Well, you know, as good catechized Lutherans, that is not the fact. We're talking about two radically different definitions, even though we're using the same word. The same goes with science. Science is used with a whole bunch of different definitions, often in the same article that we're reading in a newspaper. Science, for me, is the scientific method baseline. And I like using this definition because when people talk about, well, I believe in science, and then you say why, because it's enabled us to develop such incredibly useful technologies. Well, all those incredibly useful technologies come directly out of the scientific method. So that's why I like this as a baseline definition. How does the scientific method work? It is really, really simple. You start by asking a question. During daytime, is the sky blue? All right, we're baseline scientific process here. Second, do some background research. I've talked to friends and neighbors, I've gone to Wikipedia, I've done a Google search, and it appears that majority of the time, if it's not cloudy, the sky is indeed blue. Construct a hypothesis. The sky is blue during daytime when it's not cloudy. Are you following me so far? This is a very simple process. Test your hypothesis by doing an experiment. So what's your experiment? Walk outside, open the doors of Bethel Lutheran Church. We look outside, we look up at the sky. Yes, indeed, the sky is blue. Now you're thinking, well, that's not an experiment. It didn't involve test tubes, and it didn't have a spectrometer, and there is no computer modeling necessary. Well, those are extensions of scientific research, but true scientific research should come down to, ultimately, in the best case, something you can see, hear, touch, taste, or smell, right? It's empirical. It has to do with your senses. So the simplest experiment that you can do is to go out and either listen for something or look for it, right? Analyze your data. I went outside on May 20, what is it today? The 26th on a Saturday, and I looked up at the sky in Kitchener, and it was blue. Or right now it's gray, but that's because it's cloudy, so I'll have to redo my experiment tomorrow. Report your results. Yes, the sky is blue. That's the scientific method. And that is where we've gotten the most powerful and essential innovations in what we call our scientific culture, our scientific civilization. Computers, GPSs that we all rely on because we can't figure out how to get to Toronto. Pointers, the lasers, surgery, vaccines, all of this comes out of the scientific process. Now, the scientific process is great for some questions. Why is the sky blue? It's actually not great for everything. There are questions the scientific method is not designed to answer well. Like, for example, did Jesus ever exist? If we had time, we could walk through the scientific method and try and construct a scientific method to answer that question, and you'll have a really hard time, short of having the doctor as our friend who has a TARDIS, and we can get in and we can go back and we can see, what actually happened on Golgotha with our own eyes. Short of being able to travel in time, historical questions are incredibly difficult to answer with the scientific method, but that doesn't stop us from trying and often getting radically different answers depending on where our starting point is. This is, for example, why we have debates about evolution, debates about the Big Bang, debates about the age of the universe, because all of those are historical questions. Non-repeatable historic events that we can't travel back in time and see whether our experiments are correct or not. So science is very powerful for things that we can deal with in the here and now, or in the close past or the near future. But when we start getting far into the future or way into the past, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker in its ability to give us productive answers. Science can also be seen as systematized knowledge. By the way, theology was once queen of the sciences. Did you know that? Theology is considered a science. It's a way of systematizing knowledge. Now we talk about mathematics being the queen of the sciences. Christianity loves scientific knowledge or systematized knowledge. We are not opposed to that, especially Lutherans, right? How many of us have whole libraries filled with systematic theology books? We're scientists, just scientists of divinity. The problem is, and this is what we'll talk about more when we come back, that most people, when they use the word science, do not mean the scientific method. Most secular people, when they use the word science, mean methodological naturalism. Now, what is methodological naturalism? Methodological naturalism is the idea that we can learn things about the world assuming there is no God. All right? So that means that we have to start our evaluation of something that we're studying in the world, excluding possible hypotheses and excluding possible conclusions. So, divine agency is not a proper hypothesis or conclusion of a true scientific investigation. That's where you start from. Then science goes out and runs an experiment and comes back and says, aha, we found no God. Well, of course you found no God, because by definition you can't. You've decided that you can't look for divine agency, you can't apply Romans 1, and therefore you can't have that as a conclusion that we have found design or intelligence or an omnipotent creator. So this is fundamentally the problem. And we're going to unfold this in the next couple sessions. We're going to end here. The problem is not science versus faith. It's not our source of authority versus other sources of we go by authority and other people go by their senses. It's one source of authority versus other sources of authority. And it's two definitions of science. One that excludes possible conclusions and one that includes anything as a possible conclusion, which I would argue is what good science should always do. And with that, we're going to let your brains cool off, and we'll take a little break.